All right, let's step back in time. Get ready for a deep dive into the mind of, well, a Roman emperor.
Sounds intriguing.
It is, and this emperor also happened to be a philosopher.
Talk about a side hustle.
Right, we're talking about Marcus Aurelius and his Meditations, but this isn't some big, philosophical statement for the public.
You're right. Meditations wasn't meant for an audience. It's more like personal notes, reflections, even struggles that he wrote down, almost like a processing his experiences and trying to guide himself.
So we're peeking into the private journal of, well, one of history's most powerful men.
Absolutely.
Right.
We see a side of Marcus Aurelius, a side we wouldn't see in public. His doubts, his anxieties, even, his struggles to live up to what he believed in.
Okay, so before we really, dive into his diary, who was this guy? Marcus Aurelius 101, please.
Well, he was the Roman emperor, ruled from 161 to 180 AD. A pretty chaotic time wars, plagues, you name it. But in all that chaos, he was known for his wisdom
Mm.
and ruling with philosophical ideas,
Mm.
which earned him the title Philosopher King.
Yeah, philosopher king writing in his diary got my attention. And speaking of philosophy, Meditations is heavily influenced by Stoicism.
It is.
I have to admit, I'm a little rusty on my Stoicism. Could you give us a quick refresher?
Of course. Basically, Stoicism is about using reason and virtue to face life's challenges.
Okay.
It focuses on what we can control, like our thoughts and actions, and then accepting the things we can't. It's about, resilience, inner strength.
Resilience and inner strength, qualities I think we all could use more of these days. But how did Marcus Aurelius, as emperor, with all that power, actually apply Stoicism? I mean, it can't be easy to stay grounded when you're literally ruling the world.
You're absolutely right, it's not. But in Meditations, we see glimpses of how he tried. He constantly reminds himself about serving the common good, even when things were tough for him personally. He was really aware of how power can corrupt, what he called imperialization.
Imperialization. I'm not familiar with that term. What does that mean exactly?
It's that tendency for power to, well, inflate the ego, like it distorts how you see reality.
I see.
Marcus Aurelius recognized that danger and actively fought against it. He was always checking his own motives, trying to stay true to his principles.
So he was using Stoicism almost like a way to stay accountable, to avoid the traps of power.
Exactly. And we see this in his leadership. There's an example in Meditations where he's dealing with a rebellious senator. Instead of just reacting, he reminds himself that maybe this senator is acting out of fear or misunderstanding, not necessarily malice. And that allows him to approach the situation with empathy, trying to find a solution that benefits everyone, not just his own ego.
Wow, that's pretty incredible. Instead of just force or anger, he chooses understanding.
Right. He's using his philosophical framework to navigate leadership, recognizing that true power is in wisdom and justice, not just authority. It's that effort to match his actions with his Stoic beliefs that makes his leadership so fascinating.
It's like he's deliberately choosing to be a philosopher first and an emperor second.
It does seem that way sometimes. He's always working to live those Stoic ideals, even with all that pressure and responsibility. That's what makes his story so compelling.
It's a side of him we don't often see. We tend to think of Roman emperors as, well, all-powerful, not vulnerable individuals with doubts and dilemmas.
And that's why Meditations is so valuable. It's a peek behind that curtain of power. We see a man who is really introspective, committed to a life of meaning, even while ruling one of the most powerful empires in history.
That's quite a contrast.
It is. Welcome back to our deep dive into the mind of Marcus Aurelius.
It's good to be back. Last time we, set the stage, got to know Marcus Aurelius, emperor A&D, philosopher, right? And touched on those core principles of Stoicism he was working with. But I have a feeling it's more complicated than just Stoicism.
Right. Stoicism was the foundation, but Marcus Aurelius wasn't, limited to just one way of thinking. He was interested in a whole bunch of philosophical and spiritual ideas, actually.
So Meditations isn't just a Stoicism textbook. He's drawing from other places, too.
Exactly. Think of it like a philosophical mixtape, blending Stoic wisdom with insights from, well, anyone who really resonated with him.
I like that. So who else made it onto his philosophical mixtape? Who really spoke to him?
One that comes to mind is Epictetus. He was a Stoic philosopher who lived about 100 years before Marcus Aurelius.
Okay.
And his story is amazing. He was born a slave, but then became a really famous teacher of Stoicism.
A slave turned philosopher.
Right.
Wow, that's quite a journey. What were some of Epictetus's big ideas that Marcus Aurelius really connected with?
Epictetus had this very, practical, down-to-earth approach to Stoicism.
Mm.
He was all about focusing on what truly matters, accepting what you can't control, and working towards inner freedom through virtue.
Okay.
He really believed that it's not what happens to us, but how we think about it that causes us problems.
So it's not about what happens, but our perception of it.
Precisely. And you see this idea, a central one to both Stoicism and Epictetus, echoed a lot in Meditations.
Mm.
Marcus Aurelius is always, reminding himself to examine his judgments, to question his assumptions, and to choose how he responds, rather than just, like, reacting automatically.
That's a powerful message, taking responsibility for how you feel inside, no matter what's happening outside. But I wonder, did this idea come from Epictetus originally, or did Marcus Aurelius encounter it elsewhere too?
Well, this idea that our perceptions shape our reality, it's a recurring theme in philosophy. One figure who explored this way before the Stoics was, of course, Socrates, the Athenian
You're
philosopher.
right, right.
Marcus Aurelius quotes him a lot in Meditations, clearly admired him. Socrates was all about self-knowledge, reason, and living virtuously.
Socrates, a true philosophical heavyweight. I can definitely see why Marcus Aurelius was drawn to him. What were the specific things about Socrates that resonated with him?
Well, Socrates believed that the unexamined life just wasn't worth living. He pushed his students to, question everything, challenge their beliefs, and truly understand themselves. He had this famous argument that no one willingly does wrong, suggesting that ignorance is the root of all evil.
Okay.
This connects back to the Stoic idea that even those who hurt us are often, well, acting from ignorance or skewed perceptions.
So basically, know yourself, choose to act right, because real evil often comes from a lack of understanding.
Exactly. And Meditations really embodies these ideas. You see Marcus Aurelius constantly checking his own thoughts, motivations, trying to live a virtuous life. He even extends like a kind of understanding to those who do him wrong, recognizing that their actions might stem from a lack of, well, wisdom or insight.
It's amazing to see that perspective from an emperor, you know? Instead of revenge or punishment, he chooses empathy.
It really shows how deeply he believed in his philosophy,
Hmm.
his commitment to applying it even in tough situations.
Hmm.
Now, there's another pre-Socratic thinker who seems to have had a big impact on Marcus Aurelius, Heraclitus.
Heraclitus, the philosopher of change. I've heard the name, but how did his ideas show up in Meditations?
Right, so Heraclitus is famous for, well, kind of cryptic, paradoxical sayings.
Okay.
And he often emphasized that everything's impermanent, in constant flux. His most famous quote, "You can never step in the same river twice," sums it up perfectly.
The only constant IS change, it's a little unsettling, but also freeing, right?
It is, and you find this idea of constant change woven throughout Meditations.
Mm.
Marcus Aurelius constantly reminds himself that everything's in flux, like he's urging himself to embrace change, not hold on to what's fleeting, and to find peace in the natural order.
Considering he was ruling an empire with, constant challenges from inside and out, it makes sense that he found comfort in those ideas.
Exactly. If change is inevitable, why resist? Right.
Mhm.
Better to learn to adapt, go with the flow. It's a good lesson for anyone, emperor or not.
It is.
And it speaks to the Stoic idea of aligning yourself with the natural order, accepting what is, and focusing on what you can control. We've talked about the philosophers who influenced him, but his writing style itself is fascinating too.
Yeah, we touched on that earlier. I'd love to hear more about what makes Meditations different from other philosophical writings.
Well, as you said, Meditations wasn't written for an audience. It was his personal journal, a place to work through his thoughts, wrestle with his doubts, and find comfort in philosophy. And you see that personal nature reflected in how he writes.
So it's not a polished philosophical treatise, right? It's
Now,
something raw, more intimate.
exactly. Meditations is all fragments, short reflections, aphorisms, personal notes, even quotes from others. It's not like a structured argument or a textbook on Stoicism. It's more like a series of snapshots into his mind as he's, dealing with life's difficulties and searching for meaning in all the chaos.
Like, we're getting this unfiltered glimpse into his inner world. That makes it all the more compelling, don't you think?
Absolutely. It's that rawness, that authenticity that makes Meditations relatable, even centuries later. It reminds us that even emperors, even philosopher kings, struggled with the same basic questions about life, death, the search for meaning that we all do.
And speaking of those big questions, I'm especially intrigued by how Marcus Aurelius writes about death. It's a theme that pops up throughout Meditations, and I wonder, how did he approach this universal human experience?
It is fascinating. And you'll notice his view on death is a mix of Stoic acceptance and a very human, Well, kind of melancholy.
Can you unpack that a bit? How does he approach death from both those sides?
So from a purely Stoic point of view, death is just a natural part of life, right? It's going to happen, so why fear it or fight it? It's like the seasons changing or the sun setting, just part of the natural order.
So acceptance is key.
In a way, yeah. But then you see these moments where Marcus Aurelius grapples with, what death means personally, not just as a concept. He writes about how death erases individual identities, how it turns all our achievements, hopes to dust. He thinks about friends, family he's lost, those who've already gone. And you feel this real sadness in those reflections, a recognition of how fragile life is.
So even a Stoic emperor, someone preaching acceptance, couldn't help but feel the weight of death, huh?
Exactly. He was human, grieving lost loved ones, facing his own end, and trying to make sense of it all. And it's that tension between Stoic acceptance and personal grief that makes his writing about death so powerful.
Yeah. It's like he's saying, okay, death is natural, but it's still painful, still important, very human.
It is, and it highlights this Stoic idea.
Uh-huh.
Find meaning, purpose in life, even though we know it'll end.
It's a call to really live, appreciate each moment, make the most of our time. Which I think brings us to another big question Marcus Aurelius wrestles with: the meaning of life.
You're right, that question threads through the whole text. It's fascinating to see how he looks at it from different angles.
Yeah.
Sometimes he focuses on the Stoic idea of living in harmony with nature, fulfilling our role in the universe's plan.
So we're all part of this grand design, and our purpose is to play our assigned role. That could be comforting, especially when things feel uncertain.
It can. But then Marcus Aurelius also grapples with, personal meaning, like finding something that gives our life value, purpose, beyond just our cosmic role.
So even a Roman emperor had existential crises.
Even a Roman emperor. It just goes to show, no matter who you are, we all grapple with these fundamental questions. What's a good life? What gives our existence value?
So does he offer any answers, any roadmap to finding meaning?
If there's one thing clear in Meditations, it's that there's no simple answer, no one-size-fits-all solution. He doesn't give us a step-by-step guide. Instead, he encourages us to, really reflect, examine our values, and find what truly resonates with us individually.
So it's about the journey, not the destination, the process of seeking meaning, rather than finding a definitive answer.
Exactly. And that highlights the Stoic emphasis on personal responsibility, taking ownership of your life, choosing your own path. He's basically saying, look, there's no one right answer. You got to figure it out for yourself.
That's both daunting and empowering, isn't it? We have the freedom to create our own meaning.
It is. And it reminds us that finding meaning is a lifelong thing. It's something we're always grappling with, refining as we grow and change. And speaking of growth, another important theme is virtue. Marcus Aurelius comes back to it again and again.
Right. Virtue seems to be a key part of his philosophy, but what does he actually mean by virtue? What does it look like practically?
For him, like for Stoics in general, virtue is the highest good. It's the basis of a meaningful, fulfilling life. And he defines it as living in accordance with nature, which means acting rationally, justly, and for the benefit of ourselves and others.
So it's not about following a strict set of rules or being like perfectly good. It's about aligning our actions with our rational social nature.
Exactly. And for Marcus Aurelius, this means developing qualities like wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance. These are the virtues that let us navigate life's challenges, make good choices, treat people fairly, and find inner peace.
So virtue is like the key to a good life then.
You could say that. He believed true happiness doesn't come from achievements or possessions,
Yeah.
but from the inner qualities that make us good people. The things that let us live in harmony with ourselves and the world.
That's a pretty radical idea, especially today when success is often tied to money and external validation. It reminds us that true wealth is in character, in integrity, living a life that reflects our values.
You got it. I think that's one of the most valuable things we can take from Meditations. It's not about what we have, but who we are. Now, we've talked a lot about the philosophy behind Meditations, but remember, for Marcus Aurelius, it wasn't just an intellectual exercise.
Right, he wasn't just talking about virtue, he was trying to live it, which must have been tough as emperor, right?
Absolutely. And one of the things that makes meditation so compelling is that it's not just abstract principles. It's a record of him actually trying to live them out in the real world with all its complexities. We see him struggling with leadership, the temptations of power, and the constant pressure of making decisions that affect millions of lives.
It's like we're seeing him trying to be a good man, even while ruling an empire. Makes his story all the more relatable, right?
It does. because it reminds us that we're all works in progress. We're always trying to live up to our ideals, even when dealing with the messiness of life. And in that way, his struggles, doubts, and successes, they become like a source of inspiration for our own journeys.
It's nice to know that even a Roman emperor, someone admired for his wisdom, had his own moments of doubt. Makes his achievements even more impressive.
Exactly. And it reminds us that pursuing virtue isn't about being perfect, but striving to be our best, even when things are tough.
What a powerful message. We've covered a lot of ground. The thinkers who inspired him, his unique writing style, and those big questions about death, meaning, and virtue.
And we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to meditations, like his personal reflections on his life and his struggles.
Sounds like we have a lot to discuss in part 3.
We do. And as we continue exploring, keep this question in mind. How can we apply Marcus Aurelius' wisdom to our lives, even in a world so different from ancient Rome?
That's something to think about. We'll be back soon with part 3 of our deep dive into meditations. Until then, keep reflecting, keep exploring. Welcome back to our deep dive into meditations.
It's good to be back, ready to unpack those final layers of Marcus Aurelius' thinking.
We've talked about so much already, haven't we? Stoicism, the thinkers who influenced him, that unique style of his writing, and of course those huge questions about life, death, and meaning.
We've really journeyed through a lot of his inner world.
But I still feel like there's more to discover, especially when it comes to why meditations feel so relevant even today after all these centuries.
You've hit a key point there. I mean, Marcus Aurelius was a Roman emperor. He faced very specific challenges. But there's something timeless about his thoughts, something that people still connect with.
I think it's because beyond the emperor part, we see a real person dealing with, well, human problems, the same kind we face now.
Exactly. The stress of leadership, dealing with difficult people, trying to find your purpose. These are things we all experience, no matter the time or place.
Speaking of difficult people, I was struck by how Marcus Aurelius handles frustration and annoyance. I mean, he was the emperor. You'd think he could just, tell people to stop being annoying.
You'd think so, right?
Hmm.
But instead, he uses those Stoic principles to manage his feelings, even those very human ones.
Hmm.
He reminds himself that other people are acting based on their own views, their own judgments, which might be wrong or incomplete.
So instead of getting angry, he tries to understand where they're coming from, even when they're being totally unreasonable.
Yeah. He realized that getting upset wouldn't actually change anything. It would just, mess with his own peace and prevent him from responding well.
That's a very practical approach. Like
Yeah.
he's saying, okay, this is annoying, but I decide how I react.
Exactly. It's about focusing on what you can control, which is a core part of Stoicism. You can't control how others behave, but you can control your own response.
It's about changing your mindset, isn't it? Instead of being a victim of circumstances, you take responsibility for your own experience.
Exactly. And we see this all the time in meditations. He's constantly reminding himself, don't get caught up in what's happening outside. Focus on your own thoughts, actions, reactions. Choose a response based on reason and virtue, not just automatic reaction.
It sounds a bit like mindfulness, doesn't it? Being aware of the present moment and choosing your response carefully instead of just reacting out of habit.
You're right. There are a lot of similarities between mindfulness and Stoicism. They both emphasize self-awareness, focusing on the present, and thinking through your responses.
So how do we actually get better at choosing our response, especially in tough situations? Does Marcus Aurelius give any practical advice?
He does. One technique he uses is, well, I call it cognitive reframing. He basically steps back and tries to see things from different angles. He challenges his own assumptions and looks for a more helpful way to interpret what's happening.
Do you have an example of that?
There's a part where he talks about dealing with those difficult people, right? Instead of just assuming they're being mean or malicious, he reminds himself that maybe they're acting out of ignorance or fear or something he doesn't understand. And this shift in perspective, it helps him be more compassionate instead of just judging them or getting angry.
So instead of this person's out to get me, it's more like maybe they're struggling with something I don't know about.
Exactly. And that change in how he sees things, that cognitive reframing, it allows him to be more patient and understanding. Doesn't mean he's approving of bad behavior, but it's a more nuanced, compassionate way to approach it.
He's choosing to take the high road, even when it's tempting to just get caught up in the drama.
That's a great way to put it. And it reminds us we always have a choice in how we react to people, to tough situations. We can choose anger, frustration, or we can choose understanding, even compassion.
And that choice makes a huge difference in how we feel, in our own well-being.
Absolutely. It's not about pretending we don't have emotions, but choosing how we respond, making sure our actions match our values, even when things are hard.
This reminds me of another big theme in Meditations, the idea that everything's connected. Marcus Aurelius talks about that a lot, doesn't he?
He does. That idea of interconnectedness is really central to his philosophy. And it comes from the Stoic belief that the universe is guided by this rational principle, the logos. It's in everything, connecting it all together.
So it's like we're all part of this massive web, and what we do affects the whole system.
Yeah, exactly. And realizing that interconnectedness changes how we live our lives.
How so? How does that belief actually change how we act?
Well, for one thing, it makes us more aware of the consequences of what we do. If we know that our actions don't just affect us, but the people around us, the whole world even, we're more likely to act responsibly, thoughtfully.
Like having this built-in ethical guide.
Right.
Knowing we're all in this together makes us want to make choices that benefit everyone, not just ourselves.
Right. And it also creates a sense of humility. When we see ourselves as just one small part of this huge, complex universe, it's harder to get caught up in our own ego, to see ourselves as separate from everyone else.
It's a reminder that we're all connected, we depend on each other, and ultimately we're responsible for each other.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the most powerful messages of meditations. Our lives have meaning and purpose, not just by themselves, but in how we relate to everything else.
It's a beautiful idea, very humbling. It gives you this feeling of belonging, purpose, even hope in a world that can feel pretty chaotic and unpredictable.
It does. And it reminds us that even small acts of kindness, compassion, just doing the right thing can make a difference. They contribute to the well-being of the whole.
So even if we're not Roman emperors, we can still have an impact.
Absolutely. We all have a part to play in building a world that's more just, compassionate, and harmonious.
What a great note to end on. Wrapping up our deep dive into meditations, it's amazing how much this ancient text still speaks to us today.
It really is. What Marcus Aurelius wrote about life, death, virtue, and how everything's connected, it's just as relevant and thought-provoking now as it was centuries ago.
He reminds us that real happiness isn't about achievements or what we own, but about building inner strength, being virtuous, and finding a purpose that connects us to something bigger than ourselves.
And he encourages us to live with awareness, intention, and compassion. To remember our actions have ripple effects, and we're all part of this incredible interconnected web of life.
If you haven't already, I highly recommend picking up Meditations and exploring it for yourself. You might be surprised by how much it resonates with our modern world.
It's a journey of self-discovery and philosophical exploration worth taking.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the mind of Marcus Aurelius. We hope you enjoyed the journey and will continue to think about his wisdom long after this episode.
Keep exploring, keep reflecting, and keep striving to live a life of virtue and purpose. Until next time.